I'm Jill Pelaez Baumgaertner. I am professor of English and dean of humanities and theological studies at Wheaton College, where I have been for 36 years. I taught in the English department for 21 years. I consider that my primary identity. But I'm also a dean over an academic division, and that has been a very different kind of life for me. It has its own kinds of challenges, but it does give me occasional time to write poems. I always have one poem going on my desk. The beauty of a poem is that you can keep returning to it. It's usually complete on one page. If I were a novelist, this would not work. What Cannot Be Fixed is the name of the book, and it's also the name of the title poem. I was in Ireland at the Tyrone Guthrie Artist Centre about 2.5 hours north of Dublin for 6 weeks. And when I was there, we had a lot of artists. We had graphic artists, we had sculptors, we had musicians, poets, fiction writers. And one night, a violin maker came and spoke to the group. And he was fascinating, and what he brought with him was a bag full of broken violins that he thought he could repair, and some that were beyond repair. And he passed them among us, and the whole experience was rather odd. My daughter's a violinist, so I was particularly interested in this, and realized later when I got home that I really did have a poem. I took notes. I remember taking notes about everything he said, and then I got home to the States, and I wrote this poem, What Cannot Be Fixed, which I could read to start off. What cannot be fixed? Anything can be repaired, the violin maker says, except for woodworm or the violin inside the fire-melted case. A violin is more than its own strings sound, the wood thin and flexible, loose for sympathetic resonance, leaning into the cello's timbre, leaning into your own voice. Things can go wrong, he says. The glue must not petrify the instrument. Even the sound post sometimes eats the wood and begins to push its way through. Or the fingerboard can loosen and warp the soundboard. Or a person changing bad strings can release tension so fast the sound post shifts. Or the instrument can be fraudulent, aged with artificial nicks, fake repairs. But most can be fixed again, he says. The last button missing on his shirt. Repairing a violin is like stitching something which is torn, he says, rocking on his heels. Unwrapping necks, wood, damaged violins to pass among us. We handle them warily, uncertain how to touch these specimens of imperfection, blackened by fire, crushed by the car's fender, caught in the flooded basement, frozen in the abandoned car. So I wrote this poem, and then I set it aside. And a few years later, Don Martin contacted me, and he said that he was interested in maybe putting together a manuscript for the series, a poema series. And I didn't think I had enough poems at that point, so I said, well, check with me again later. So he did, and I think the third time he checked with me, I thought, when does anybody ever ask for a volume of poems? How could I be cavalier about this? So I looked at my work, and I realized I really did have a theme going in work which I had just published individually in individual journals, but which I could bring together in a collection. And what drove my thinking was actually an experience which does not appear in this book, but which supports it, is the background music for it. And that was the experience with my granddaughter. She was 6 years old at the time, and she was diagnosed with epilepsy, with a very small, benign, inoperable brain tumor that caused her to have 50 to 60 seizures a day. And they tried everything. This could not be corrected surgically because it was in a very vulnerable portion of the brain. So they tried. The medications did not work. It could not be fixed. And really, what this book is about is that I'd already written the poem that was about what cannot be fixed, and so that is what drove my thinking, and of course brought up all the big questions about God's presence, God's involvement in this, the possibility that there could be healing, but none of the questions were answered at the time. I think if I started with a big question, I couldn't write a thing. What I do is start with a situation which probably has the question at the core, and I work with that, whether it's a biblical character or a story I've heard, something I've observed, and then the big question comes out of it. If it doesn't come out of it, then I haven't really finished the poem. Because a poem really must connect with something larger than the poem itself. And it also must surprise you as the writer, as you are writing it, with possible avenues of exploration and possible other questions that come out. So, for example, recently I was asked to write a poem for a theology conference at Wheaton. The conference was on Imago Dei. And they said, we would love to start the conference, since this really is going to have a lot of artistic implications, this whole subject. We'd like to start the conference with a poem. They also asked Brett Foster to write a poem, and he did. But I sat down with this whole assignment, write about Imago Dei. That's a terrible thing to ask anybody to do who's a poet, who's an artist. But I worked with ideas for several months. Nothing was happening, nothing. And then I realized this isn't the way I write a poem. I don't write a poem beginning with a theological concept, with a big question, with a Christian doctrine. I write a poem about my new granddaughter, who was the result of in vitro fertilization, who came into this world after my son and daughter-in-law had been married for 20 years, and she was Imago Dei. So I wrote a poem about Zola, this granddaughter who's now 2 years old. And in the process, I was able then to ask that big question about, where is God? What is the image of God? How does it connect with the technological advances that we work with every day that allow us to manipulate, these kinds of events? And the poem worked because of that. So the big questions, I hope they're there. I think they're there, but they don't begin there. Another example, recently I was in Israel, and I had been asked to write a poem about Mary Magdalene because we were visiting Magdala. That was my assignment for the trip. So I worked on this poem, and I did a lot of research on Mary Magdalene, and I thought I had something, but it was just a retelling of Mary Magdalene's story. It never surprised me. It never asked the big questions. It's a dead poem. I read it, and then I put it away. Yes, let me read those epigraphs. The word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord, come and go down to the potter's house, and there I will let you hear my words. So I went down to the potter's house, and there he was working at his wheel. The vessel he was making of clay was spoiled in the potter's hand, and he reworked it into another vessel as seemed good to him. And from Psalm 51, let me hear joy and gladness. Let the bones that you have crushed rejoice. I was definitely, in choosing those, thinking of my granddaughter, the one with epilepsy. I love the contradiction of it. I love the grief and the rejoicing, the suffering and the rejoicing, in the psalm passage, and the broken pot and the new pot side by side, the contrast in the Jeremiah verse. I'm a Lutheran. I'm in love with paradox and contradiction, with the tension with which certain ideas have to be held, and this fits. Recently, a very good friend of mine, a composer with whom I have worked quite a lot in recent years, Carl Schock, lost his wife, Noelle. This happened just this past week, and at the funeral, and I think this is common for many people at many funerals. It was both tears and laughter. We were. We laughed about stories about Noelle. We cried about the loss. And this is our lives. We live lives of contradiction, variety, and richness. I don't understand God. I have questions all the time about God. I have questions that lead me in directions which some people think are dangerous directions. I recently read one of my poems to a friend of mine who's a rabbi. I want to read that poem. It's called "Let Them." It's based on Matthew 19. He names them: Samuel, Isaac, Mary, all of the anonymous daughters of Jephthah, the infant of Bathsheba, and those 42 children who laughed at bald Elisha and were torn limb from limb. Let them come. Let them push their small shoulders into the crowd of Rachel's children. Let the holy innocents stand so close they can see the beating pulse of his temple. Let them come. All those with delicate wrists, small ankles, pudgy or thin arms, round bellies from feast or famine. Let them feel the breath of God on their precarious necks. Let the armless child from Iraq rest on his knee. Let the Vietnamese girl with burning skin remember his cool fingers. Let them come. Do not hinder them. Smooth the path. Clear the way for him to feel the press of them, the warmth of their perilous bodies next to his. And before I published the poem, I handed it to my husband to read, and he said, Do you really mean to say, let him feel the warmth of their perilous bodies next to his? Don't you mean imperiled? And I said, no, I mean perilous. And he said, well, why are they dangerous, these bodies? And I said, well, because what they do is what the plight of suffering children always do. They call into question the justice of God. So this rabbi friend of mine read this poem, and then he wrote his poem in answer to it, in which what he did was he took Jesus' words, and in between every line, let them come, bring the little children to me, he listed Jewish children's names, and then he listed Birkenwald, Auschwitz. It was devastating, and horribly ironic. And he said to me, I understand exactly why you use the word perilous. That's what you were saying. And really, he's the only one who's ever understood this. But then he said, that's blasphemy. And I said, well, I don't think I meant it that way. And he said, but you are questioning the justice of God. And I said, I guess that's part of God that I do not understand. What I do understand is the God on the cross who cries to God, saying, why have you forsaken me? That is a most remarkable event. And I also have a poem about that in this book. Because what you have is God experiencing the silence of God the way we do. And it is on that particular moment, really, that I hang my faith. So I'm beginning to sound really dour and Scandinavian, which I'm not. But yes, it's God is. What we do is we approach Him in the evangelical world. We approach Him with such familiarity and casualness. And what we're doing is we're talking to the King of the universe. And He has given us a way to approach Him through Jesus. But we are still talking to the King of the universe. And there's something terrifying about that. There's even something terrifying about grace, because there's nothing in the world that we can do to deserve it, to embrace it on our own. And so that's where one of my poems came from. It's a poem I wrote when I was in Spain. I was doing a Fulbright in northern Spain in the Basque Country. And when I arrived in Spain, the students at the university where I was supposed to be teaching were on strike, which was a novel concept to me. But what it meant was that for 6 weeks, I had nothing to do. And my family wasn't with me. My husband couldn't join me. My son was in college. My daughter was quickly finishing high school so she could join me. But I was alone for 6 weeks in a foreign country with not a lot to do. And so this poem came out of that. It's called Bilbao Alone. Some of the sounds here are familiar. Vivaldi plays the same in this language. Keys rattle in locks. The engines of buses sigh as they turn street corners. But something is different, an odd solitude. It digs itself under my watch into the small bones of my wrist. Here in this place are no extras. I play the leading role, but I am as anonymous as my skeleton. I have no drawers of envelopes and paper here, no cupboards of glasses turned neatly upside down, no simmering stews, no one whose knees fit perfectly behind mine as I sleep. Nothing of myself is here except myself. What I have extends over vast landscapes, and it requires me to do nothing. I sit in a park and watch what passes. Short, Basque men whose tobacco lingers long after they have gone. Dogs whose interest is each other. Workmen with a ladder. The dignified bus driver before the return trip, hands crossed behind. And then suddenly it is twilight. Sometimes one watches for no reason other than the eyes. Is this grace, this waiting, a simple existing in sight of it? Is it always as ominous as these first few hours of unfamiliarity? There was nothing I could do except simply accept it. And it was not comfortable. I have other poems in which I talk about faith being rather terrifying. Let me read another one of those. It's a poem called Faith. Faith. It can be too careful. A ledge balancing tiny slide of the foot over slick surfaces. When it finally happens, it should be more like a hurdle into sudden air off a cliff, faced with ragged signs of the earth's upheaval. Or the rushed snatch of a demon Ferris wheel that refuses to secure you with belt or rail and seizes you up in its mechanical hands to whisk you higher, higher. When I first began teaching at Wheaton, I remember being very taken with the students who were so earnest and asked such wonderful questions, and always challenged me to bring faith into my teaching, which I had never had the freedom. I'd never been in an environment where I had the freedom to do that. But I also realized, as I got to know them better, that there was a kind of perfectionism, a deadly perfectionism, driving many of them, and it really seeped into the way they handled their faith too. And I would read Anne Lamott to them and talk about the need, as she says, she sits in church and she looks around her and she can't believe that people don't have on crash helmets because of what they're going to hear. So that's what I was referring to there. You know, I don't particularly like to write what is called now confessional poetry about myself and my experiences. I always am, of course, writing about them, but in disguise. But in the last part of the book, I start asking the question, who am I in the midst of all of this? Beginning with my identity as a Cuban, of Cuban heritage. So I brought in some of my poems that I've written about that. I also wrestled with the questions. It's a rite of passage to lose your parents. And I have a poem about my father's death and a poem about my mother's death. I have a poem about my daughter at a point when she was a teenager and we thought there was a serious illness. It turned out that there wasn't. But, you know, the position a parent goes through when the child is suffering. So what I was doing, of course, was talking about who I am in relation to God, in relation to these big questions. And the last poem in the book is a poem called Dear Grass, in which what I do is talk about a friend of mine who had an experience on a horse. She was riding this horse, and she was riding into the country, and she saw a deer. And the deer was injured. There was blood on the deer's leg. And because she was on a horse, she could get close to the deer. The deer allowed that. If she had been not on a horse, she wouldn't have been able to get as close to the deer as she did. But what could she do? There was nothing she could do. So I realized, as I was thinking about my relationship with this friend, I realized this whole experience really described my relationship with her. I could only get so close to her. I knew there was great suffering in her life, but there wasn't anything I could do to pry that out of her, to take that away from her. And so I finished the poem, and I realized that what I was really talking about was my relationship with God. I can get so close, and then I'm never close enough. I think that's what we experience. Most of us. There are some rare individuals in this world, I think we call them saints, who seem to be able to bridge that gulf. But that particular poem, I found out that once again, in writing about something local, particular, I was really writing about something much bigger. Would you like me to read that poem? Yeah. Okay. Deer grass. The soft earth imprints your steps from car to paddock, where you see that once again you must hoist the saddle, sling the bridle across your shoulder, wind the reins, and heavy foot the fields to find her, where with only slight resistance she will swallow the bit, feel the spread of blanket, then the heft of saddle, the girth tightened. Adjusting the stirrups, you will smell the leather rich with horse, appropriate for this hour, when although you would rather have propped the saddle against the damp trunk of the plum tree, only now hinting of bloom, and feel the power of her as if her muscles were your own, you give in to decorum, but only this much. You know already that riding horses is about many things. The wish of her gait through unmown grass, jumping small hedgerows with a clean leap, and compromising between giving up and gaining. You take her on, and she takes you. How do I know these things, when you have told me only this much, that on a horse you can approach a deer if you remain as still as caught breath? I remember the Florida trails heavy with sun and heat, not your Illinois pasture in this lately arrived spring, but a time between childhood and now. The flies I could never outrun, the scrubby land, palmettos, pines, Japanese cherry bushes lining the barbed wire fence, moss dripping from the oaks that occasionally span the road. I'd slow from canter to walk, lean forward, wrap my arms around the horse's neck, the coarse mane against my cheek. But now I imagine you have been drifting from thought to thought as she takes the lead, makes decisions at the edges of fields, riding gently the crisscrossed paths, when there in the half-sun of newly leafing trees is the deer's calm stance, containing the stun of injury, dried blood ridging the leg. She looks across the path at the horse, you, her head alert for sounds, her nostrils feel the air. You know the hurt of her and can only sit still, motionless with desire for healed wounds. Someday, when we have talked the afternoon into silence, the water suddenly still, I will watch the horizon, motionless, and you will tell me of the day you rode to the edge, as close as the mare could take you without giving you away, knowing that to a deer, a part of the saddle is nothing more than a part of the horse. You, carrying the stillness, like an extra sense, I sitting without stirring, as you tell me how soft the earth was, how the morning opened before you, and the deer stepped into it, as a match scritched into flame for its few seconds, bringing fire to fingers, closer, closer, then quickly out.